Good morning, everyone. So let's get started. Just a couple of housekeeping stuff. We do have masks available. So if you would like to have one, we have masks outside on the table. Another thing I want to remind you, at UVU, we do have an accident exhibit, rules of knowledge. So after the symposium, if you do have time, you can check it out. It's on the ground floor in the library. It's amazing. So it was established under the previous President Holland when he was here. It was an amazing exhibit to check it out. So good morning again. My name is Wei Hong Wang. I don't have a special treatment. This is a name tag for my child care provider. So there is other good thing. You can see everybody has multiple identities, right? I'm a mother, I'm a professor here. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Earth Science at UVU. I'm so glad to see everyone here today. So when I came to UVU in 2012, I never thought I would make a strong connection with Utah Lake. So here we are, I'm so glad I did. So since then, I did a lot of research on Utah Lake. So we got to know the lake, its past, its current, and hopefully we can help with the future. So one thing I'm very glad, our students started to understand the lake better. So they are able to create or start the informed conversation with their friends, family, and with the local communities. So one of the reasons why we are here today together, that is one purpose. We want to inform you guys and what's going on and what we can do to help with the lake. I'm so amazed by Utah Lake. I cannot imagine if one day if we lose this lake, it's going to be a disaster. We can do things together to make the lake better, but I don't think we can make the lake better by bringing more people to the lake. That is not a solution. So today we're going to hear a lot more, scientific research and other experts. But for now, I'm going to pass the microphone to our phenomenal scientist, Dr. Ben Abbott and BYU. And also I want to inform you, this is the one secret. He's not only an outstanding scientist, he's also an excellent event organizer. I'm so impressed. So he's leading this. So he is leading this effort to put everything together. I'm so impressed by your ability, Ben.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. That was a very generous introduction, and I just want to join Dr. Wang in welcoming you to this very important event. We're thrilled to see so much community interest, such a great turnout. And if you didn't know, there are beverages over in the corner, and lunch will be served. So if that's what you came for, you won't have to wait too long. I'm going to move this camera. So I also wanted to recognize all of those who are joining us via this live stream. And it always makes it a little bit difficult to have a hybrid event, but hopefully it won't be too awkward. Wei Hong and I prepared just a few slides, and then we'll pass the time over to Kevin for the first session. First of all, even though this event has been planned in just a few weeks, there has been an amazing outpouring of support. At the back of the room, you can see some of the sponsors who've stepped forward. I want to recognize them by Environmental Ethics Initiative, Sunrise Engineering, Utah Valley Earth Forum, Big Monocle, Clyde Snow, New Skin, Rio Tinto, and the Utah Valley Chamber of Commerce. Could we give them a round of applause, please? And there are 22 individuals who've been working day and night to bring this together over the past few weeks. Don't have time to go through all of their names, but here are their pictures. Please look at the website. You can learn about each of them. Why don't we give the planning committee a round of applause as well. Now, we asked you when you registered to say why you care about Utah Lake. And Isabella Arrigo put together, this is just a word cloud. The size of the word represents how many times it came up in your response. The location and color don't mean anything, they just added it for prettiness. But I thought it was a really nice reflection. We sometimes assume that people are not informed or that they don't care about Utah Lake. And yet this group, both here in person and virtually, shows that's not true. Now, one last thing. You're going to hear a lot of information today. We've tried to compile much of it on the website. That website is going to be a permanent library of information about Utah Lake. So please go check out the About Utah Lake tab on the website. It has everything from the history of the lake to its potential future. There also is a live symposium schedule. There have been a few changes. There are programs available at the back, but we'll just walk you through it. It's a very simple structure. We'll have talks right now, a break for lunch, and then a panel where your questions can be answered. And that's the last thing that I wanted to say. There is a live question and answer button on the website. It's such a large audience, we wanted to make sure that the questions you were most interested in floated to the top. So please submit your questions there. You can also rank the questions of others. You can upvote or downvote those questions. So you can just go to utahlake.byu.edu. Again, that's utahlake.byu.edu, and then click on that live Q&A button. That's the way that you can ask questions. You can do it at any time up to and during the panel. And so let's end here with Brother Brigham, who wants all of us to save Utah Lake. And that's indeed the hashtag for today's event. So if you're interested in posting on social media, just add that hashtag and then people will be able to find it. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the time over to Kevin to introduce our first round of speakers.
Dr. Abbott, this is Erica.
Yes.
We're getting some notes in the chat that people online can't see the slides.
Okay.
Check the sharing.
Let me fix that real quick.
We appreciate your patience. This hybrid event is technically challenging.
Screen one, share. Thank you very much, Erica. Can you, any chance they can hear now? Or see the slide?
That looks good. That looks good.
Okay, thank you.
So did PowerPoint die? Did we shut it off?
And then you can find the talks right here. But Erica will run her own, actually.
Oh, she's going to run her own.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
So I'll just stand here for a second, Kevin.
Let's do it.
And run the stuff.
All right, we're fortunate today to have a number of experts who are going to present information about the past, present, and future of Utah Lake. Unfortunately, because of the timing, their talks are closely timed, and we won't be able to allow questions for this part of the symposium. So let their presentations stimulate your thinking. You can put those questions in online, and then they will also, these presenters will also be on our large panel so that you can, those questions can be answered by them at a later date. So we appreciate your patience in holding your questions until the large panel. Our first speaker today is Erica Gaddis. Erica is a director of Utah Division of Water Quality for the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, and she will give her presentation now.
All right, there we go. Good morning, everybody. It is fantastic to be with you, and I'm really excited to be part of this event today. Utah Lake, as you all know, is critical to the state of Utah. It has many issues and many opportunities, and many of those touch water quality. And so I'm going to focus today on kind of the state of the lake and what we're working on with respect to water quality issues. I also think water quality and the Clean Water Act in particular gives us a great place to start a conversation about the interface between science and policy, which I think is a great theme for this meeting here today. So Utah Lake water quality is challenging. It is a highly productive lake. We have a lot of algal blooms. We have cyanobacteria blooms that have effects on public health, on aquatic life, on recreation, and on secondary water uses. The Clean Water Act and the Utah Water Quality Act protect the lake for all of those uses. Utah Lake is a shallow lake. The ecology is different from the ecology that we typically study in some of our deeper mountain lakes and reservoirs. So this requires us to conduct site-specific investigations. You're going to hear more today from a couple other speakers on the history of Utah Lake, so I won't spend much time on that. But it did transition, we believe, from a clearer lake state to the current eutrophic turbid lake sometime in the 20th century. In terms of the state of Utah Lake, water quality is impaired for several different uses. So we protect the lake, like I said, for aquatic life. It has a warm water fishery use and a waterfowl use. And we have impairments due to high levels of ammonia and exceedances of pH. And both of those we think are associated with productivity or high algal blooms, especially in Provo Bay. On the recreational front, we have an impairment for the harmful algal blooms, including the cyanobacteria blooms. That's impacting boating, fishing, swimming, water skiing, which are all important recreational uses on the lake. And we have another impairment that we aren't spending as much time on right now, which is a salt impairment. The total dissolved solids in Utah Lake is not supportive of the agricultural uses. So we really started our work in earnest on Utah Lake after the bloom in 2016 that many of you probably recall. You can see the satellite imagery there of the bloom, across Utah Lake that caused Utah County Health Department to close the lake for a couple of weeks. And we all sort of really started to pay a little bit more attention. The impact of that was not just in Utah County. You can see the release of water from Utah Lake into the Jordan River in that photo there. And we learned very quickly the extent of the connection between Utah Lake and Salt Lake County. This is a map here that just shows the extent of the canal system that draws from the Utah Lake system. The Division of Water Quality has several different angles that we're using to address the algal bloom issues in Utah Lake. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about the prevention, that is understanding the root causes through our Utah Lake water quality study. We also work closely with our health departments to provide health advisories to mitigate the impacts of algal blooms and protect public health. And most recently, we've been working with the Department of Natural Resources to explore treatment options for Utah Lake. As many of you probably know, and others will talk in more detail, the factors that contribute to algal blooms are complicated. We know that there are links between increasing temperatures, and you can see there, we have seen increasing temperatures across Utah, including in Utah County over the last 20 years. Increased nutrient loads, and those include loads from our wastewater sources, our stormwater sources, agricultural sources, as well as natural sources. And then water clarity and water levels do have some influence as well. So we have sort of all of these different angles. Our particular angle from the Division of Water Quality is to regulate nutrient loads into Utah Lake. So we engaged in a study in 2015-16 timeframe. It is a long-term study. You can see the timeline here, but the goal is to develop nitrogen and phosphorus criteria that are protective of the lake's designated beneficial uses, and a comprehensive implementation plan that will include addressing point sources, non-point sources, and internal cycling of the nutrients within Utah Lake. You can see we've committed to our regulated community not to implement new regulations until 2030. Our study is about halfway through. We should have results by 2023. The study is being conducted in a consensus-based, transparent process to support science-based decision-making and to address, to make sure that we're capturing growth. You can see here that we've got a steering committee that was approved by the Utah Lake Commission. They sat a science panel that's overseeing the study's contractors. The recommendations from this study will come back through that same pathway to the Division of Water Quality and to the Water Quality Board for adoption. This will likely require review and approval by the Utah legislature before it can be submitted to EPA. Our project is about a $3.5 million project, in addition to leveraging a number of other resources, which I've listed there. So real quick, the steering committee is fantastic. We have a 16-member steering committee. You can see who's on that here with representation from across the various stakeholder interests. Eric Ellis and I co-chair that steering committee. We have 4 representatives from the wastewater side, so 3 municipal and 1 publicly owned treatment works. We have representatives from recreation, agriculture, fish and wildlife, public health, recreation, and environmental interests. So for the last year and a half, the steering committee has spent a lot of time articulating what the water quality management goals for Utah Lake should be. And those are specific statements about the desired water quality condition to support societal, economic, and ecological values of concern for recreation, aquatic life, and agriculture. I won't go through these in detail, but you're welcome to peruse them. We have a quite long document, a table actually, that outlines all of these management goals and then the metrics that we will use to assess whether we're successful in attaining these goals. So for recreation, we want Utah Lake to support a robust recreational industry and increased recreational opportunities and experiences for the community. For aquatic life, we want Utah Lake water quality to support a robust and healthy fishery, as well as waterfowl and shorebird communities. And you can see some of those sub-goals there, but again, encourage you to have a look at the more detailed document on our website. For agriculture, we want toxins in Utah Lake not to harm livestock or crops. Pretty simple. So the steering committee sat a 10-member science panel, and I'm pleased to see some of our science panel members are presenting here today. We have 6 science panel members from Utah and 4 from out of state. These are some of the most renowned scientists working on lake issues across the country, and we're really grateful for the attention that they're putting into this project. I won't go through them all in detail, but you can see they were selected based on their discipline. We have a kind of multidisciplinary team to make sure that we're really getting the studies done in a way that's robust and can support good long-term decision making. The initial charge to the science panel from our steering committee were really 4 questions, and those 4 questions line up quite nicely with the panel or with the symposium's goals here today. The first was, what was the historical condition of Utah Lake with respect to nutrients and ecology pre-settlement, and along the historical timeline with consideration of trophic state shifts and significant transitions since settlement. And Dr. Brani will talk a little bit about our progress against that question here today. Also, what is the current state of the lake with respect to nutrients and ecology? We've spent a lot of time developing both an online platform as well as some reports to really explain the current status with respect to nutrient loading and the dynamics within the lake, how that's affecting algal blooms and how that's affecting the ecology. Third question is, what additional information is needed to define numeric nutrient criteria that support existing beneficial uses? So again, we're developing criteria that will be approved under the Clean Water Act so that we can regulate the lake towards those goals. And then finally, is there an improved stable state that can be reached under the constraints of current water and fishery management? So as I said earlier, we're about halfway through this study. Our science panel has been working for about 3 years now, and we think we have about 3 more years. Not going to get into the details here. Yeah.
Erica, your time's up. If you want to just wrap it up quickly.
Oh, I thought I had 15 minutes. My apologies. Okay, so Utah Lake is complicated. We have a number of studies that are going on. You'll hear about many of those, but basically we're trying to understand the unique site-specific nutrient dynamics of Utah Lake. We're moving now into the implementation planning stage. So this is really where the policy elements come into play. So all of that science will be used to develop and calibrate models that we can then ask questions of to evaluate future state scenarios with respect to different nutrient reductions as well as growth projections for Utah County. We will assess those against all of the goals that I mentioned earlier. One of the biggest challenges for Utah County is that we have significant growth projected. And so all of our planning and implementation feasibility analyses need to incorporate that projected growth. The red here on the map shows the urban and developed that's projected between 2010 and 2050. I want to acknowledge that the publicly owned treatment works, the wastewater folks around the county have already gotten started. Most of them are in the process of large, very expensive upgrades to their facilities to reduce nutrient loads into Utah Lake. So I want to give a shout out to them, and our Water Quality Board has been very supportive of those projects with financing in the last few years. And with that, I'll just leave it with this slide that ultimately the challenges of Utah Lake will require us to evaluate some really challenging trade-offs with respect to both costs and benefits. And apologies for going over time. I thought I had 15 minutes.
Oh, great. You did a great job. Let's thank Erica. Well done. Okay.
Hey, I will share my own screen if that is okay.
So I thought it was, according to the plan, Mary was next. So yeah, Mary's next. So let me introduce our next speaker here. I just want to show this slide. She doesn't have any slides, so we'll just put this in the background. There we go. We're fortunate today to have our second speaker, Mary Meyer. She is the chief executive of the Tipinogus Nation. And the Tipinogus Nation was the original inhabitants of what is now Utah Valley and much of central Utah. The reason we picked this venue, by the way, is there's a great view of Utah Lake, except for there's haze today, but you can still see Utah Lake. It is a beautiful lake, and it's even more beautiful when there's no haze. Mary?
Stand. I can hold it, I guess. I stand before you today, thankful to be alive. The blood and bones of my people are laid throughout this great valley and throughout this great state we live in. I am Mary Meyer, Chief Executive of the Tipinogus Nation. I descend from the royal bloodline of the great chiefs that once ruled this entire Wasatch Range. Their blood gives me the authority to speak on behalf of my people, the land, and the inhabitants that reside here this day. I am here on behalf of the people, the survival of the lake, the fish, the wildlife, the reeds that for hundreds of years gave my people sustenance and life. Our people raised families around these waters. We laughed and played. We worked and toiled. We swam, we fished, we utilized the surrounding foliage to make the necessary tools and medicines. Above all, we prayed. We held ceremonies. We danced and we sang around the lake that once stretched to the edge of the great salt lake that was known at that time as the Tipinogus Lake. Our people, the Tipinogus, were the rock water carriers. We carried the salt that was used a custom we carry on to this day. When Mr. Abbott asked if we would share our feelings about the new project for the lake, I read and researched all that I could find. It made me happy to hear that the lake that once bore our name, or would be reconnected with the river that once bore our name, and that it would be cleaned and restored to its natural beauty, restored close to what it once was, a place of peace and beauty where our people and the people of the surrounding areas could relax from the hectic world we live in and find peace. The new project suggested changed all that. It broke my heart to think of an island in the middle of the lake. But what saddened me most was that it would be privatized and house approximately 500,000 people. This brings with it a series of concerns. Water, gas, electricity would need to be taken to the island. Would this be ran through the lake? Also, in wintertime, when the highways are filled with ice and snow, it would take salt to clear them. This too would go into the lake. And sad to say, but people come with trash. Would this also be dumped into the lake? Utah Lake for many years has been a dumping ground, a place to dump chemicals, sewage, and other trash. It seems to me this project would do more to damage than help. When the lake is privatized, will the surrounding communities be locked out? Where is the guarantee that the people of these valleys will be able to freely roam the banks and enjoy the lake, having picnics and quiet time? What about the hopes of restoring the endangered June sucker? Our people ate these fish for many generations. This fish is indigenous to one area. Is their habitat to be destroyed? This, like us, have endured near extinction and deserve to live. Think about tomorrow and the future generations. We as Native people say you must look ahead 7 generations when making decisions, because what we decide today affects future generations. Utah, I ask that you please take heed to what the experts opposing this project have to say. Our people and the reeds around this lake gave you your name. This lake leads honored and respected. We stand in favor of restoring the lake to its natural beauty, but have to oppose privatizing and desecrating this historic sacred site. Thank you for your time.
I think it's Mary's turn, right? Yes. Okay. Excellent. Well done so far. Our next speaker is Janice Brani. She's from Utah State University, Associate Professor of Watershed Sciences. And by the way, each of the speakers' full biography is on the website. So if you want more information about each of these speakers, please go there. Go ahead, Janice.
Hello, everyone. So for the last couple of years, my colleagues and my students and I have been trying to understand what the ecological history of Utah Lake has been. So a key question is, what did Utah Lake look like 200 years ago? But first, I'd like to describe a little bit how we learn about history from lakes and their sediment cores. So lakes are incredibly sensitive recorders of the environment and any changes that occur. The watershed, the airshed, and even the organisms within the lake all produce matter that gets deposited onto the sediment floor, such that older sediments are on their bottom and younger sediments are on their top. So we can take a sediment core and look at discrete intervals and analyze them for the physical, biological, and chemical remains that tell us the environmental conditions that occurred at the time of deposition. So in this way, we can read the history of the lake like pages in a book. So just a note on how I'm going to show data, just like the sediment core, the older data is on the bottom and the younger data is on the top. So I'm going to show time on the vertical axis. So what do we know about the history of Utah Lake? Well, before European settlement, we know that the area was inhabited by various Native American communities. In 1849, Brigham Young arrived. In 1883, carp was introduced into the lake system among other non-native fish species. In 1935, the lake reached its lowest level, its lowest recorded level at minus 12 feet below compromise. And in 1950, wastewater treatment plants were installed, reducing the amount of nutrients entering the lake at that time. Superimposed upon these discrete events is the overall increase in the Utah County population, and commensurate with that, the amount of nutrients that enter the lake through the wastewater treatment plants. So I'm going to use these icons to show where the discrete events occur with respect to our paleo data. So when the LDS settlers first arrived, they described the lake as being clear water with abundant fish and plant life. However, it has also been argued that the lake is very shallow and has a large catchment, which can lead to naturally elevated nutrient concentrations and frequent wind-driven suspension. So this begs the question, has Utah Lake undergone a regime shift from a clear water macrophyte-dominated lake to a turbid phytoplankton-dominated lake? In other words, has it transitioned from abundant benthic production to abundant water column production? So in order to answer this question, we took cores from 5 regions of the lake: Goshen Bay, Bird Island, Provo Bay, north of Provo Bay, and the north part of the lake. I do not have the north of Provo Bay core because a colleague has that. So one of the first things that we can do is look at the overall sediment character and evaluate how that has changed through time. So note here, I have older data on the bottom and younger data on the top. And what we can immediately see is that the 3 southern cores show these abrupt and significant, sometimes dramatic changes in the amount of organic content, whereas the north core shows a gradual increase in organic content over time. We can identify these transition periods as occurring somewhere between 50 and 60 centimeters, 30 and 35 centimeters, and 10 centimeters for some of the cores. What's really striking is that below 30 centimeters in both Goshen Bay and Provo Bay, we have actual macrofossil evidence of plant material. So all those little grass tufts you see are areas where we pulled physical remains of plant material out of the sediment core. In fact, every interval below 30 centimeters at Goshen Bay had plant material in it. In all the cores below 30 centimeters, we see abundant evidence of gastropods and mussels. So gastropods are organisms that live on aquatic plants and in nutrient-rich mud. So this gives us an indication of the environment where these cores were taken at those time periods. We can also look at microfossil remains in the sediment. So here I'm going to show some data from diatoms. These are photosynthesizing organisms. There are over 10,000 species, and the community that's present is representative of the chemical conditions in the environment, so things like nutrients and pH, but also the physical conditions like habitat. So what I'm showing here is the representation of the diatom community that's either living in the water column, the planktonic species, versus those that are living on the benthic environment. So as a ratio, so a value of 1 means equal representation. So you can see that historically in both Goshen Bay and Bird Island, we see equal representation of planktonic life and benthic life, with a slight tendency to move towards benthic life in Bird Island. But in more recent decades, we see this transition towards more planktonic production, so more diatom production in the water column versus that in the benthos. And if we compare that to our historical record, we can see that these more recent changes are occurring post-1975 as the population and climate has changed. We also looked for genetic remains within the sediment core, so little snippets of DNA that we can compare to libraries of DNA. So what I'm showing here is the frequency with which we identified the common macrophyte hardstem bulrush compared against the frequency with which we identified cyanobacteria species. So we can here again see a clear shift between macrophyte benthic production to cyanobacteria production. And here again is our chronological time series. So the last biomarker I want to show you, the last proxy I want to show you, are biomarkers, specifically algal pigments. The last biomarker I want to show you, the last proxy I want to show you are biomarkers, specifically algal pigments. So chlorophyll is produced by all photosynthesizing organisms. And Ben, I'm not sure what you did, but I can hear myself very loudly over myself, and I don't know if you can turn that volume off for me.
I didn't change anything, but I will cut the mic here and let's see if that helps.
Okay, thanks. So here's the record of chlorophyll A, and as you can see, there has been these dramatic shifts through time. So in particular, at the introduction of carp, we see a massive increase in the amount of chlorophyll. So that indicates an increase in production in the lake, and this makes sense because carp really destabilized the lake system, moving a lot of nutrients and material from the sediments to the water column. But also note the highest chlorophyll A observed is in the more modern record. So the amount of chlorophyll that we see in the sediments is represented by what the amount that is produced, but also the amount that is lost through time through degradation. So we often also look at the amount of the degradation product called phaeophytin A. Typically, these show an inverse relationship, but here they show a positive relationship, which is really interesting because chlorophyll A degrades in the presence of light. So if chlorophyll is, the sediments are being deposited and buried in the sediments under stable sediments, they will degrade slower. But what we see here in the more recent record is that the chlorophyll is readily exposed to light and is being degraded. So this is suggesting that in this core where we historically had macrophytes, the sediments were stable, but now they're actively being mixed into the water column and we see that degradation. If we look at the pigments in Bird Island, we see a very similar record, although somewhat subdued. No, we also see the highest production in the most recent sediments, but historically, we also see more degradation. So it suggests that in this location where we didn't have macrophytes, we did have some wind-driven mixing of sediments, but not to the scale that we see today. We can also use these pigments to understand the overall shifts in the algal communities. So here we see significant increases in cyanobacteria and green algae representation. These are groups of algae that are associated with eutrophic or hypereutrophic conditions. And this has happened at the expense of diatoms. So as we see increasing cyanobacteria representation, we see a loss of diatom representation. If we look at pigments in the Bird Island, we see the exact same thing. Increase in cyanobacteria and green algae at the expense of diatoms. So to summarize, pre-1883, we have evidence that macrophytes were present in Goshen Bay and Provo Bay. We have both physical remains of those macrophytes as well as eDNA. We have abundant evidence that gastropods and mussels were present, indicating that the sediment environment was different than today. Overall, lower production in the lake. We saw greater, most of that production was happening in the benthos as opposed to the water column, and we had stable sediments. From 1884 to 1975, we see that there was a massive disturbance where macrophytes were abundant, likely due to the introduction of carp. We see an increase in production overall in the lake, driven by diatoms. We see a loss in these benthic organisms, specifically gastropods and mussels, and we see decreased sediment stability. In the most recent time period from 1975 to present, we see increases in production to the highest levels observed. We see greater water column production and lower benthic production, and we see a shift in cyanobacteria and green algae dominating over diatoms. So lastly, I would just like to thank the funders. So this work has been funded by DEQ through the Utah Lake Science Project, as well as through Utah State and my lab, the Environmental Biogeochemistry and Paleolimnology Lab. So thank you.
So thank you. Who knew you could learn so much from mud? I thought that was fascinating. Thanks, Janice. Our next speaker is our conference organizer here. He's also a scientist and an expert on Utah Lake. Ben Abbott is a professor of aquatic ecology at Brigham Young University. Once again, his biography is online if you want to read more about him. And I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, all of the previous speakers. I wanted to give some special recognition to Chief Executive Meyer. We only got in contact, I think, 3 days ago. And yet this lake, this area meant so much to her that she drove almost 3 hours, I believe, to join us today. And it's amazing to see, as we have a perspective where we include all of the voices, that we learn about the cultural and spiritual importance of this area. We learn about the scientific and personal importance of this area. That's the only way I believe we can move forward. So I was asked to speak. I asked myself to speak, I suppose, about the current status and threats facing Utah Lake. I wanted to recognize my family who have come here from as far away as New York, my wife who is here in the room with us, and all of my family who supported me in this. And this work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Division of Natural Resources, Utah Division of Natural Resources. So we don't have enough time to go into all the details. I again just wanted to point you toward the About Utah Lake article that we've put on the website, and also the fact that there are over a dozen pre-recorded talks that have been made and contributed. And so after the symposium, please take the time to look through those talks. You can learn everything from how to sail in the desert to the detailed paleolimnology like Janice showed us. I'm going to first talk about the current status of the lake. And there are multiple ways of thinking about this. This is a picture from the Nelsons, I believe. I'm just going to go through quite quickly and talk about some of the changes that are going on. Habitat and biodiversity are increasing in the lake. As many of you are aware, the June sucker, one of the endemic species in Utah Lake, was delisted this year because of concerted efforts in the water community. Downlisted, yes, thank you. Still is endangered, or still is threatened, no longer endangered. The water flow from the lake has increased. As Janice mentioned, in the 1930s, the lake went dry several times, largely because of water extractions, also because of a long extended drought during that time period. Thankfully, because of cooperative agreements, the water flow has increased. Now, this next conclusion is somewhat in conflict with Janice's data, and this is very common in science. Depending on how you measure something, you sometimes get complementary and apparently conflicting results. So this conclusion is based off satellite images. For the past 35 years, we have measures of how green the lake is, which is a proxy of how much algae is there. And several studies have shown that for the lake as a whole, over the past 35 years, there's actually been a decrease in the intensity and extent of algal blooms. Doesn't mean that we're in the clear. And of course, as Janice said, compared to the pre-1975 time period, we still are having frequent algal blooms. And this last one is an important fact. The public is becoming more aware of the lake, but they still are not visiting the lake. And there still are many misconceptions about the lake. So I see that as a mixed bag. Just to talk about a couple of scientific results, this is a paper by Randall and others. Let me see if I can hide this. I'll put it up at the top. That shows the concentration of nutrients, in this case, total phosphorus in the lake bed. And you can see that there are areas of elevated phosphorus, especially in, down here in Provo Bay. However, it's a really interesting story where in much of the lake, you don't see a strong influence of anthropogenic or human-caused nutrients in the sediment. So contrary to what we often hear, the lake is not polluted all throughout the lake. There are many areas that have a good ecological status. And here is the result from Sinead Tate, who just finished her master's degree, showing areas in blue have had a decrease in algal bloom. Where along the eastern shore and in Provo Bay, where you have a lot of human nutrients going to the lake, there has been an intensification of some of those algal blooms. However, the lake as a whole has potentially seen some recovery from that period that Janice was talking about. Now, there are threats, of course, that are also facing Utah Lake. The most important, in my opinion, is apathy and disconnection and misunderstanding from the lake. I was talking with a longtime resident of the valley who asked me, because they knew that I studied water, hey, what is that? I climbed Tipinogus the other day and I saw a huge water body. What is that lake called? And that's, of course, an extreme case, but it's not a unique case, unfortunately. There are many people who do not visit the lake who aren't aware of it. And until we recognize its value and beauty, it'll be difficult to ensure its protection. There also are threats from development. Now, the change is coming no matter what. So we have the option of smart development. And I hadn't heard this term before, but I suppose the opposite is dumb development. And so we have a choice to make. Do we want to just continue building everywhere, build causeways and degrade the habitat? Or do we want to be strategic about where we develop? And then there also are dangerous proposals, as have been mentioned several times. I'll leave that. There's a legal panel speaking next that'll deal with that in more detail. And finally, climate change is altering the conditions of the lake. It's disrupting precipitation. And then there's a strong correlation with the satellite data between water temperature and the algal blooms. Algae can reproduce more quickly. So this is just a graph that shows decreases in snowpack. On average, there's been a 20% decrease in our snowpack since the 1950s. So we've got to think about these threats as we move forward. So here is a really interesting analysis by the Valley Visioning that was commissioned by our county that shows different possible futures. On the left is the baseline land use. This is what will happen if we just continue to grow without too much strategy. On the left is the vision where we could have some concentrated development. We can preserve some of our beautiful agriculture, some of the natural spaces. It's hard to interpret. So again, go on the website to look in detail, but the choice is ours. Now, there's some aspects of the lake that make it incredibly resilient to human disturbance. It's naturally cloudy. Now, it certainly was clearer in the past, particularly before carp were there. However, the evaporation from the lake forms several minerals that give the lake what I consider to be a beautiful and milky cloudy color. Sometimes in the evening, you see sunlight reflecting off of the lake and illuminating the bottom of clouds. It's really unique and gorgeous. That shades much of the water column and makes the lake more resilient to algal blooms. Likewise, the fact that the lake is shallow, which is a natural attribute of the lake, means that it doesn't split into hot water on top and cold water on the bottom. So it's very well mixed. That's a big deal because in other areas, when you have algal blooms, you have fish kills. And you also can have release of many pollutants from the lake bed when you lose that oxygen. So the very nature of the lake is a huge benefit to us. It gives us a little bit more wiggle room. So we don't have any dead zones, and we're having very limited release of phosphorus, mercury, and other pollutants from the sediment. The third aspect is that the evaporation and also the lake bed are constantly removing nutrients from the water column. So this is a free service that the lake is giving us, worth tens to hundreds of millions of dollars every year, thanks to the natural processes in the lake. Finally, we have a population that cares about quality of life and also conservation of the lake. We have been amazed at the diversity of stakeholders who have come forward who want to protect and restore Utah Lake. There are also aspects of the lake that make it vulnerable. Janice mentioned this. Utah Lake has an enormous watershed, almost 3,000 square miles. That means that changes anywhere in this giant area can affect the water quality and water quantity in the lake. Also, we live in a semi-arid environment, which means that we have a lot of pressure on water. It's extracted primarily for agriculture, but also the growing population. We have some of the fastest growth anywhere in the United States. Approximately 600,000 people live in the watershed today. That is expected to grow to 1.3 million by the middle of the century. That's almost, it's 80 to 90% local growth, right? We have large families in this area, though there is also some immigration. And then, though there are many people that care about Utah Lake, the understanding of the ecology, hydrology, history, cultural meaning of the lake I find is quite low. Skip over that. I want to emphasize a few things that Utah Lake does for all of us. Put 7 up there, and again, you can go into detail. It regulates our climate. It is the source of precipitation. We get lake effect for snow. It provides water for all of the communities, both human and non-human, around the lake. It's crucial habitat. The Great Basin is 98% land, and then about 1.5% salt lakes, and only about 0.5% freshwater lakes. It is an oasis in this large area. It's one of the reasons why I have a hard time understanding why we'd want to fill in that 0.5% that's wet and build there, right, when we have so much land around it. It freely removes nutrients and pollutants, like I mentioned. It protects our air quality. The areas that have not protected and ensured water flow to lakes like Utah Lake now spend millions of dollars abating the dust that can form during windstorms. It has world-class recreation and views. And then for me, and many of us here, the lake has spiritual and cultural importance. It is a sacred place for us. It is the heart of our community. So just wanted to end here. I spoke with the June Sucker earlier, and this is a direct quote, actually. 7 recommendations thinking about moving forward. Number 1, let's foster community and connection. So all of you are here. You can be change agents, talking to people about the value of Utah Lake. I see the Utah Lake Commission is here. Check out utahlake.org, a fabulous resource that's been working for many years to rehabilitate the image of the lake, which is an important thing. We need to have smart development. The development is coming no matter what. We need to be strategic. We need to figure out a way to coordinate among communities. We need to continue restoring river flow to the lake. There's been big advances. There currently is a water banking pilot that the state is running that could allow agricultural farmers to be more flexible with their water use, returning some of that water to the lake. We need to be creative. We need to continue decreasing pollutants from wastewater plants and the watershed as a whole. All of us are going to need to do our part. With this many people in such a large watershed, it's not any one stakeholder that can solve this problem. We need to continue removing invasive species and restoring habitat. Again, I consider this to be one of the biggest success stories so far. We need to protect the lake from irresponsible and dangerous proposals. And then finally, we need to take climate change seriously. We can't keep our head in the sand. This is actually an opportunity for our valley to have clean air, also address this global problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. So far, you've had some very interesting presentation. Hopefully it's stimulating ideas in your mind or thoughts or questions. So please go online and submit your questions. They get ranked and the panel will hopefully answer as many of those as we can in the next in the session after lunch. Our final presentation is actually a video. It's a panel of people, of lawyers in particular. We're gonna shift gears here a little bit, move away from the science and move into some of the legal aspects of Utah Lake. Our panel consists of Craig Golly. He is a partner in the Salt Lake City office law firm of Holland and Hart. He's also a professor of law at Brigham Young University. Brigham Daniels is a law professor at Brigham Young University. And our final panelist for this part is Andrew Follett. Andrew is a student at Yale Law School and a graduate of the University of Utah. And he's been participating in organizing this as well. So he's been working from distance, but I believe he's here today. Is that right? Andrew, good to have you here. All right, so we'll play this video and then we'll move on to the next session. Where is it?
I think you can click anywhere.
Well, welcome to the Law and Policy
Follett. I'm a student at Yale Law School, and I've been interested in the law of Utah Lake since I was an undergraduate at the University of Utah.
My name is Craig Galley. I'm a partner in the law firm Holland and Hart. Recently returned from 3 years abroad.
We're going to address three questions. What are the federal law implications that folks should be thinking about when they think about potential development of Utah Lake?
My task today in a short amount of time is to discuss several environmental regulatory requirements, what the permitting process would look like, the administrative review process, and the judicial review process. And this discussion is not all inconclusive, but will simply provide some highlights of things to look for in the future. There are 5 federal environmental statutory requirements, regulatory requirements that came to my mind when I read a little bit about the proposed project. The first, of course, is the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 10, which requires a permit for construction of structures in, over, or under, excavating from, or depositing material into any other work affecting the course, location, condition, or capacity of navigable waters. Now, this dredging project and fill project, if it actually were to move forward, might be one of the largest ever attempted in the United States, given the magnitude. So this will definitely implicate Rivers and Harbors Act jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers. In addition, the Clean Water Act, Section 404, requires a permit to discharge dredged or fill material into waters of the United States. And Clean Water Act Section 401 requires any applicant for a federal license or permit to conduct any activity that may result in a discharge of a pollution into waters of the United States to obtain a certification from the state that the discharge will comply with the applicable effluent limitations and water quality standards, not only for construction of the project, but during operation and life of the project. The Endangered Species Act, Section 7, requires that federal agencies in consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ensure that any action authorized, funded, or carried out by the agency is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of endangered or threatened species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat for such species. And then finally, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, requires all federal agencies to evaluate major federal actions and inform decision makers and the public of likely environmental consequences of proposed projects and evaluate alternatives. Now, there are 2 requirements that I'd like to zoom in on that often are implicated in controversial projects involving dredging or discharging in waters of the United States. The first is NEPA requires an evaluation of the project purpose and need impacts, and especially of alternatives. But the Clean Water Act 404(b)(1) guidelines go one step further and require that, quote, no discharge of dredged or fill materials shall be permitted if there is a practicable alternative to the proposed discharge, which would have less adverse impact on the aquatic ecosystem, so long as the alternative does not have any other significant adverse environmental consequences. Now, what typically happens in a project like this is the Army Corps of Engineers acts as lead agency or co-lead agency to prepare an environmental impact statement to support legally sufficient, what are called records of decision under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Water Act and Rivers and Harbor Act, which again, in the ideal world, addresses all the requirements of NEPA, the Clean Water Act, and other federal statutes. And we see NEPA and the Clean Water Act having similar but slightly different, the Clean Water Act having a more robust alternatives analysis to find the best practicable alternative. The administrative process can take years, as well as the judicial review process, because under the Administrative Procedure Act, these records of decision issued by the Army Corps of Engineers and other federal agencies can be challenged in federal district court. So these are very complex regulatory permitting projects, as well as judicial review that can take many, many years. So with that, I'll end it there.
Thank you, Craig. And I do think that's probably the most complex part of what we're looking at. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. That was very helpful. Next one for you, Andrew, or talk to us about the state law implications of a project like this.
Sure. For the past 4 years, beginning in 2018 with the Utah Lake Restoration Act and now seen in the Utah Lake Authority Bill, the primary momentum in the legislature has seemed to be towards transferring the bed of the lake in exchange for restoration projects. And the major hook that policymakers need to be aware of is the state's public trust obligations under Article 20, Section 1 of the Utah Constitution, which essentially creates a trust relationship obligating the state to maintain perpetual control of some resources, such as the bed of Utah Lake, forever and for all generations of Utahns, so that no single legislature could just, by a simple majority, alienate huge amounts of resources and impoverish the public's trust portfolio. This section of the Utah Constitution, as it was suggested in a 2019 Utah Supreme Court opinion, essentially constitutionalized a federal public trust doctrine, which is best communicated in a case known as Illinois Central. And so Illinois Central, as it's relevant to us through Article 20 of the Utah Constitution, tightly constrains and controls government's ability to manage special resources like the bed of Utah Lake. It might allow for the disposal of lake bed for pinpointed, very limited purposes, such as the erection of a dock or a pier, but it certainly forecloses anything that might, quote, abdicate the general control of the state over lands under navigable waters, end quote, for example, an entire lake. Similarly, even temporary leases or temporary grants of control over these special resources can be struck down, as the court said in its case Coleman. And so we take from all of this that the state, whether it be through legislative charter, the FFSL, or the Utah Lake Authority, attempting to permanently surrender significant portions of Utah Lake, should be aware of the state's trust obligations, as well as the state judiciary's ability to intervene and stop any of these oversized transfers. Similarly, because, as the Utah court stated, it's a matter of federal common law, the federal judiciary, which has previously stopped sovereign land transfer as small as 20 acres, would probably have a hook to step in. And so although private capital is certainly welcome in remediating the lake's woes, the lake bed itself, the public trust doctrine teaches us, is not a permissible matter of compensation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Craig. But just shifting gears just for the last couple minutes, I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about this Utah Lake Authority. The question I would like us to address is, taking a step back from the specifics of that, what are the major things that we would, or the design principles we would look towards in trying to come up with some sort of legislation if we were going to create something like a Utah Lake Authority? And I'll start out with that, and I'll be quite quick. So for me, I think that there are two major components that I would be interested in seeing, and I think would be wise. The first is to minimize the state's litigation risk under the public trust doctrine. One of the things I would like to see is some provision that if there was going to be in a lake authority, for example, that I would want to make sure that there were enough safeguards put into place that any attempt to do so would conform with the public trust doctrine, and make sure that there are some protections for that, including perhaps additional judicial review. The second thing that I would point to, that I just think this is such a complicated issue. There are so many different parties that have interests in the lake, all the municipalities around the lake, the counties. I would concerns that different entities that had an interest in the lake, that there was some ability for those folks to be heard. So I would be looking for very much robust public participation requirements before any decision is made. I would also really encourage, to the extent possible, to make these decisions as collaborative as possible, particularly if we're going to be making such a large change that seems to be permanent in nature.
I'll hop in. I think that before any projects begin, the state has an obligation to all of us as taxpayers to demand adequate and very robust financial assurances so that we can be positive that project managers can either follow through on their promises and that they have the necessary means, or on the other hand, that they can clean up their mistakes should they fail or otherwise become insolvent. In simplest terms, this means that the state should demand that they show the money up front. I think that this is necessary for sound, conservative resource management. And I think otherwise the authority bill risks being a disaster.
And Craig, any last thoughts?
Yes, teeing off of what you said about the benefits of having robust public participation and collaboration, I will say that that holds true of the federal permitting process as well. The fact that it takes so many years to go through the NEPA and Clean Water Act, Rivers and Harbors Act evaluation process makes some project proponents feel like, oh, wow, we want to disengage. We want to share as little information as possible. We want to hunker down. But I would argue, both from the perspective of a former Department of Justice attorney defending Clean Water Act permit decisions issued by the Army Corps of Engineers, and then in private practice, both defending and challenging environmental impact statements and 404 permits, I would say that the more robust the collaborative process, the more transparency, the better documentation that exists, the better the administrative record is for those who are trying to defend it, to be able to point to efforts to completely flesh out issues of concern and evaluate them in a robust fashion. So with that, I think our time is over. And on behalf of the panel, we appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you.
Well, as often happens in situations like this, we of course went over time. We were to start lunch by now. So we're going to take a short break here. You can go out and pick up a free lunch for those of you who are registered. And I think we have enough for everybody, right? Yeah, we do, for those who are in attendance. So we appreciate your participation and attendance here. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch, and we will get back together at 12:30 to continue the panel discussion. Howdy.
Why is it that the proponents of the Utah Lake Restoration Project won't invite participants?
You guys had your own meeting back in April. So this one, we were trying to limit it more to mostly experts.
The anti.
No, just the experts on the lake. I attended your meeting back in April.
That was a private meeting, not held by a university. The one that we had at Geneva Rock.
Yeah.
Their offices. Yeah, that was a private meeting with elected officials and experts to tell them what we're doing. But all of these questions could be answered.
This is a public meeting, so it's open to the community, open to legislators.
It's not open to our side, though.
Huh?
It's not open to our side. We could answer every one of those legal questions could be answered. but we're not able to participate to answer.
Well, you had your chance. You can have your own meetings. You had your own.
So
meetings.
is this
You
a
could have made
private-
it a public meeting.
Is this organized by the environmental group back there, the Utah Valley
Oh,
Ecology?
no, she was one of the organizers.
But
But
this is,
it's actually primarily organized by Ben,
is
myself.
this an
Lee
academic
Ho.
exercise though? Why
Pretty much
wouldn't you have
academic.
both sides?
Huh?
Why wouldn't you have both sides represented?
Because there's not really two sides to the science.
Yeah,
There's just the science.
Yes, there is
Fortunately.
just a science, and that's what we're relying on.
I'm sorry, what?
That's what we're relying on in all of our
No,
permit
you're not.
applications.
I don't think you. I know from the presentation that I attended.
Yeah.
There, you didn't include any of the scientists, any of the experts that we've included.
I can bring in geosyntech scientists, SWCA scientists, all of our Army Corps permits, all of our EPA permits, everything related.
So your scientists, right, they're being paid to come up with a result that you want, right? We just want to protect the lake. We love the lake the way it is. And we have no economic interest. We just have interest in the lake itself.
Don't you have
protecting
an obligation to be fair and to allow both sides to
Well, that's the
present their
thing about
evidence?
science is it's not fair, it's fact.
Well, I can
right?
give you facts. I can give you
No,
lots of facts. Half the facts I saw on the
as
screen.
a
are-
researcher on Utah Lake, I would love to hear your facts, right? But the way the facts are presented in the scientific community is you present them, there's discussions about it, they're peer reviewed
Half the stuff I've seen on the
publications.
screen has not been peer reviewed and isn't based in fact.
I'm sorry, yeah, please.
Just so you know, it's really disappointing to have
For
this.
the people who are waiting in the long food line, if you want to start by getting drinks, there's some over on this side of the room to kind of reduce the waiting times. So we're about to have our live Q&A panel discussion. So if you want to read through, this is kind of your last utahlake.byu.edu. And it'll pull up the website. If you click here on live Q&A and you scroll down, you can read through the questions that have already been asked and upvote the ones that you also want to know. And then you can also type your own questions here if any questions have been pressing on your mind for a long time now, or if new questions popped up as you listened to the presentations earlier today. The next announcement I wanted to make is about the art competition. We had a lot of amazing submissions, and we have 2 categories that you can vote on. So also on the utahlake.byu.edu website, if you click on this tab that says art competition, you can go to voting for the adults section, and all of the art pieces have been numbered. And if you scroll down to the bottom here, there it is. If you scroll down to the bottom here, you can vote on your top 3. And then the same thing with the children's competition. The voting is in a similar manner. And then last, we had, when you all registered, you had the opportunity to vote on a Utah Lake Hero of the Year award. And so we have two awards to give to our Utah Lake Hero of the Year. And one is this beautiful photo right here, donated by Jim Westwater. And then the next one, and then we also wanted to donate this life jacket to, because our award winner this year is a Utah Lake hero. He is saving our lake. And so I wanted to give the award to Jake Holdaway. He was voted it's Hero of the Year award. And he's one of our panelists, and you'll also get to hear more about why he's been given this award later. But I just wanted to read a little excerpt from one of the people who nominated him. They said that Jake is the centerpiece of the Wakara Way project, which aims to restore a large portion of lakefront and make it accessible to the public. He leads this endeavor from the heart, working with a remarkable number of entities to make something incredibly valuable for our community. He will give credit to everyone else for what he's accomplished, but his humility can't obscure the fact that he changed the world with his passion. So if everyone can give a round of applause to Jake. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch, and we'll begin with the panelists and the question and answer section now.
Thank you. I am Shannon Ellsworth, and I will give a brief introduction to our panel hour. So we got started a little late. I apologize to those who are watching live online, but we will finish at exactly 1:45. Again, I'm Shannon Ellsworth. I serve on the Provo City Council, and I work for Sunrise Engineering. And this is my partner in crime.
Hi, I'm Gabriella Lawson. I led one of the largest nutrient experiments ever on Utah Lake over the past few years, and I'm with BYU. So
excellent. So when we do our panel, we have what Ben calls a Mondo panel, and you can see we have experts from various fields. And as we ask questions, we won't ask each of them to respond to each question, but we will target individuals with certain questions that are related to your expertise. And if anyone has been to a very long public meeting, we know that there is some benefit to limiting our comments. So we would ask that you self-monitor and limit your comments to 2 minutes. Now I'm going to turn the time over to Gabriella for introductions of our panel members.
all right, so for our panel members, we have Chris Kelleher, the director.
Nope,
Yeah,
sorry, it's this one. It's this one here.
Oh, apologies. Chris Kelleher, he's the Director of Species Recovery at the Utah Department of Natural Resources. Next, we have Andrew Follett. He's a student at Yale. We have Mayor Julie Fulmer. She is the mayor of Vineyard, and she chairs $360 million investment board that revitalizes and cleans the environment. We also have Eric Ellis. He's the executive director of the Utah Lake Commission. Jamie Barnes is the Sovereign Lands Program Administrator for the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. We also have Jacob Holdaway. He's a 6th generation farmer along the shore of Utah Lake, and he founded the Wakara Way project. We also have Representative Brady Brammer. He is the state representative from District 27, and he is the sponsor for the Utah Lake Authority. We have John Mabey next to him. He is a water law attorney with the firm Mabey, Wright and James. He represents many clients with interests connected to Utah Lake. And we have Chief Executive Meyer. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Chief Wakara and Chief Arapian, and on her mother and father's side, and she is the Chief Executive of the Tipinogus Nation. And lastly, we have our wonderful Dr. Ben Abbott. He's a professor of aquatic ecology at Brigham Young University, and he's worked on many different water quality issues.
So real quick, we want to thank our sponsors for creating and facilitating this incredible event. We want to recognize the Environmental Ethics Institute at BYU, Big Monocle, Sunrise Engineering, New Skin, Rio Tinto, Clyde Snow, Utah Valley Chamber, Utah Valley Earth Forum, Conserve Utah Valley, Brigham Young University, Utah Valley University, and the National Science Foundation. So thank you to our sponsors. Let's get started.
All right, our first question is, how would islands impact landowners and business owners? And we're going to pose this question to John Mabey. followed by Jacob Holdaway.
I wish I had an advanced warning. I have no idea. I'm here representing water users in the lake, so I don't know what the impacts would be to businesses and landowners.
And feel free to defer your question to another panel member if you think they have greater expertise. Any thoughts, Jacob?
Yeah, I wouldn't be the best to answer that question.
All right, Julie, Mayor Julie Fulmer, do you have some insights?
You said islands in the lake. You weren't specific as to if they would have businesses or houses on them.
No, the question is, how would islands impact landowners and business owners?
I guess it was dependent upon where the islands were situated, if they had businesses themselves on them, if they had houses on them, and if the traffic was done well. So if you were able to pull traffic in properly. I think that if it wasn't done well and the traffic didn't circulate properly, it could, be an inhibitor to the community. But if it was done well, it might make the wind cycles better for people who were living there. It might raise the values of the houses along the lakeshore. We have public lakeshore properties, and I think that value would probably increase. I think it would probably draw more businesses towards the area, because if you were making those islands more accessible for the lake users, then it would draw people to a destination spot and it would increase their businesses. That's my guess. It's not there, so it's a guess.
That's a guess. Any other comments on that one? Okay. Representative.
Well, one of the things with the islands is it can depend on kind of like what Mayor Fulmer said, if there's development on the island or not. Quite a few of the proposals on the islands are basically bird islands that would be a habitat for birds and other migratory species. Now, one of the things that we deal with on the lake is people don't realize how big it is, and it's a very turbid lake, and it's the sediment gets the wind patterns kind of have an impact on the sediment and stir it up quite a bit. And to some degree, islands can act as a windbreak and help to quell some of the turbidity in a high wind environment. And so that can increase the safety on the lake a little bit as well. It provides some breaks for people to where they're not out in the middle of nowhere. There is somewhere to go. There's 2 or 3 deaths each year on the lake. But I don't know for the businesses I think that we need to have more specifics, and I don't think we're anywhere close to having exactly what the specifics would be for anything like that. But there are, as far as the impact, it would change your experience on the lake a little bit.
Thank you for sharing. So our next question is, who owns the lake bed?
This is an easy one, so I'll pop in. The state of Utah owns.
Make sure that mic is turned on.
Let's see. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, so this is an easy one. I'll pop in. The state of Utah owns the bed of Utah Lake. When Utah became a state in 1896, it gained ownership of all of the beds of the navigable and commercially productive or meaningful bodies of water. Like Utah Lake, this issue was litigated for the United States Supreme Court, and in 1987, the court said, certainly the state owns the bed of Utah Lake, and ownership of the lake is an essential attribute of sovereignty.
And I'll just add to that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands manages Utah Lake as sovereign lands for the state of Utah.
Thank you guys for those responses. Our next question is a science water quality question. It is, if islands are built in Utah Lake that are developed for residential and commercial use, would that development pose a threat to Utah Lake water quality? Dr. Abbott, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that this is similar to Andrew's question, very easy to answer. If you were to split up the lake into multiple basins, and especially if you were to substantially deepen the lake, I see almost no scenario where that wouldn't increase the severity and risk of having these really bad water quality issues, particularly with deoxygenation of the water. And I know that the proposal does acknowledge that fact and then proposes to use machines, bubblers and other machines to solve this problem. So it seems kind of backwards to me, where we have an ecosystem now that's incredibly resilient, and then they're proposing to change it, make it much more vulnerable to the kinds of pressures we're putting on it, and then are adding a very costly and complicated solution to the problem that they're creating.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abbott. Here's a question that comes up quite a bit. Let's get this out of the way. How likely is it that the island proposal moves forward? And how likely is it that the road or bridge proposal moves forward?
So I can take that question from Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. So currently, we have been evaluating a proposal from the Utah Lake Restoration Group. That proposal's been with our division since 2017. Currently, we are having conversations with that applicant, and the applicant is moving forward through the federal process to do an EIS on that proposal. So there's a state side and there's a federal side. And so that proposal is currently moving forward on the federal side that we're aware of, and the state process is currently in the proposal phases with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Is that a bridge or
Thank
island
you.
proposal that you were answering?
It's islands, but we call it the Utah Lake Restoration Project is what the project is.
Is there any additional insight on that or on the proposed? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the Division of Water Quality's perspective. We will be issuing the 401 water quality certification that was mentioned earlier as part of that 404 permitting process. And at this stage, we haven't seen enough detail on the project to make any sort of conclusions about impacts, either beneficial or otherwise, to water quality. We'll of course be looking at wastewater, we'll be looking at stormwater runoff. We're very interested in the changes in the shape of the lake and how that might affect potential stratification or circulation. All of those elements will be something we look closely at as we evaluate that proposal. But right now, we don't have enough information to make any sort of general conclusions.
The causeway is just under discussion right now, so it's not formally on the 2040-60 transportation plan, but it's something that's constantly in discussion as the state tries to determine how to move people through the state and how to adapt with the growth that's going to be coming here. So you'll see it as a preliminary discussion on the transportation plan, and I believe right now it's looking like it's going down to the regional airport from the opposite side of the lake. So.
All right, thank you for all your responses. Our next question is, how are Indigenous groups for whom Utah Valley represents their ancestral lands being involved in conversations regarding stewardship of the lake? And we'll pose this question to Chief Executive Meyer.
I don't really know how involved the other tribes in Utah are. We didn't know about this until Mr. Abbott notified us. So I don't know how involved everybody else is, but this is our first step at being involved. So I think there needs to be more involvement.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Go for it.
What is the typical involvement that happens with Native groups and people and public engagement? Is it when it comes to sovereign lands and state authorities? How does it just typically go through the public engagement process, or is there a different route that comes from that discussion?
I think a lot of times that depends on the jurisdiction, whether it's municipal, county, state, or federal. Is there any other comments from this panel?
I would say it's extremely hard to engage or reach out just because sometimes their history was whitewashed or not. It's very hard. It's very difficult to get to. So with the help of grassroots people just making phone calls to different tribes and trying to see, do they have any history here? What do they have? Is there anything written? Can they prove? So with the Wakara Way project, what we've tried to do is just make as many phone calls, have as many meetings. And one of the main reasons why we named our project the way we did is that we were shocked. I was shocked when I started that their history wasn't well represented in just a short amount of time. And so when I was in 5th grade, I took Utah history, and Chief Wakara was a hero to me, and I would always go down to the lake and build a wiki up just like him. And everyone has a part of Utah Lake, and you just need to make sure everyone's well represented. So I would say if they are underrepresented, every government entity that I've engaged in always had a very open, let's make sure that they're involved. But I would say it's hard to make sure that they are represented, and we need to seek them out and hear their voice.
To that point, there are no in major federal regulatory regimes obligations to engage tribes or other groups. There are public comment periods, but people are sort of obligated to organize by themselves. Similarly, at the state level, engaging tribes is a matter of policy design. So when these decisions are being made now about how we're going to regulate the lake, who's going to make those decisions and so forth, it has to be a decision in the legislature, or in some cases, maybe administrative bodies. But in other words, there's no rule that says we have to make these good choices. And that's why pressure on key policymakers is critical.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is a scientific question. The question is, the ecological restoration can be a long process. What is a realistic benchmark goal for the end of this decade? And how can citizens help expedite the process?
I'll only take this because I think that the others are unmuting themselves, because that's a fabulous question. We are used to short-term fixes, and these ecological systems take decades and even centuries to respond. Right? I think several of the presentations mentioned that there could have been several state changes in the lake. In ecology, that means that the whole food web, the whole hydrology has changed to a new configuration. And so we can't expect, there are two misconceptions that I often see. One is sometimes we're trying to restore to a state that never existed in the past. That's a big problem, right? If we're going, we call it restoration, but really it's transitioning into something new. Number two is when we have efforts that are working, it takes a long time for that to show. And so I think a lot of the frustration that people have, hey, why haven't we cleaned up the algal blooms? For me, it's not surprising at all, right? This is going to be a multi-decadal investment that we make to restore the water flow, to reduce the extra nutrients going into the lake, and then allow the ecosystem to recover. It's not something that can be accomplished.
Professor Abbott, you and I talked yesterday about floating wetlands islands that have been done all over the world. Tom Duncan, I sent you the webinar on video, documented 19 million hectares of wetlands in China have been restored to cleaning up the algae, producing a natural ecosystem in China, also in Montana and others. Has anyone in Utah on this board and anyone involved with this lake even considered that?
I was just raising my hand. We've considered it.
Excellent. Why don't we hear about an example of restoration that's currently occurring at Utah Lake and the success that we're seeing in the last 10 years?
I'm going to be presenting after this time.
Yeah.
So I can try to take a crack at that. For remediation of algal blooms, there's sort of several elements, one of which is controlling the nutrient loads or the nutrient pollution that's coming into the lake to begin with. It is true that the lake is retaining a lot of that, but what's left is driving these algal blooms. So a lot of our focus has been on the watershed, working to reduce nutrient pollution into the lake to begin with. There are other elements that perhaps Chris could speak to, with respect to the ecological restoration on the fish side, habitat, Phragmites removal, etc.
Yeah, I was gonna respond. The June Sucker Recovery Program has really had a focus to restore aquatic vegetation, natural aquatic vegetation in Utah Lake. And part of that has been removal of carp that are a non-native species out there that disrupt aquatic vegetation. And with the carp there, as you saw in Dr. Brani's presentation, the lake shifted to an algae-driven state as opposed to being driven by primary productivity driven by aquatic plants. So there's been efforts, and we have seen some ecological response to our carp removal and some plants coming back in the system, but not to the extent that we really had hoped to see.
Maybe just from a municipal standpoint, I think cities are probably doing a lot as they surround the communities. I know for our community, we work on a lot of remediation, restoration, and then revitalizing the lake. And that's, for us, I have the Geneva Still Factory that used to be in my community. So that's removing trace metals, things like that, building those wetlands along our lake shore to capture the nutrients that are going in, trying to get that secondary water. And then that restoration, well, and with that, removing the invasive species, things like that. And then the restoration is making sure we're using less water, making sure we're using different types of plants in our communities, coming up with a kind of a conservation mindset within the community, and then revitalizing it, doing things that draws people back to the lake and utilizing the lake and reminding them about why they care about the lake. So I think most cities are probably using that formula in some way. Whether it's enough or as innovative as ideas about getting out onto the lake and floating islands or islands themselves, not from a city standpoint.
I would also like talking about success on the lake. I've been involved in government entities for my entire career, and the vast majority is not seen by the general public. And so, you know, I've obviously engaged all 25 government entities that touch the lake, and I can't tell you how much is happening behind the scenes. There's a lot of thought and there's a lot of great leaders. What I've recognized is conversations and is really are happening, and they didn't happen before. So even though it's not like an end like project, you have to first start with a dream, I guess that you'd say, and then obviously bringing that dream together that encompasses 25 government entities to make sure it's a master plan. So I'm positive on the lake, like extremely positive, because when I see the difference, whether it be water quality or lands, or there's a lot of positive things that are happening. So.
Great, thank you guys. A follow-up question to that is, how do we influence government agencies?
So I think I'm the only well, there's two non-government entities. I would say sometimes we have this fictitious idea in our brain that we are not allowed to engage in our government or petition them or ask questions. And I would just say that our governments have an open book, and they are underfunded and understaffed. Our government employees are, and they're under siege sometimes. And so understanding that and trying to understand their perspective first of what they're trying to accomplish. I'm a citizen, like that's how I got here, right? But what I would say is do your homework and then plan out years in advance. Like, it's going to take time and have the patience, but also I would say be respectful. Like, understand that they all have their different specialties, you know, water, air, agricultural. So they're coming from a very different perspective, but listening, you can move the ball forward. So that's what I would say. And that's why I think that the symposium is a great thing, is you're bringing it together to listen to each other.
Thanks for sharing that. Most elected officials are not full-time, they are part-time. And the two up here on this panel, can you tell us what's a positive or effective way that citizens can interact with you?
For me, probably the easiest way to contact me is by email, bbrammer, so BBRAMMER @le.utah.gov, and it's on the legislative website. I'm more than happy to engage with anyone. During the session, it's usually my intern who's engaging because we're kind of getting swamped. But outside of session, it usually takes me between 24 and 48 hours to get back to you. And I'm pretty good, especially about Utah Lake stuff. It's a passion of mine, and I care deeply about it. I grew up staring at the lake, wondering what else it could be. Like, what more could it be? Because, I'd go down there and it was kind of gross, and I didn't think it was okay for it to be like that. And so now that, I grew up here in Orem, went to junior high, just, Lake Ridge Junior High, just like right there. And so when I joined the legislature and I started to look at what could I do, Utah Lake was a big part of something that I felt like I could have a positive influence on. And so I want to interact with you on it. I have the bill on the Utah Lake Authority, and I have been pleading with anyone who likes it, doesn't like it, wants it changed, or anything, to just talk to me about it. And I've gone, I think I've met with every city every city mayor, council, manager, and at least one of those from every city. I've been to I've worked with all the water groups. I've been trying to work with everyone that I possibly can to get us, to get as much input, because I know that there's not one person smart enough to figure out Utah Lake. We need as much input as possible. And so, reach out by email probably is the most effective for me.
Yeah, and I'll just speak generally. I think political efficacy is pretty high in the state. If you reach out to your representatives, they're going to write back and they're going to respond. And if they don't, especially for a municipality, you can just show up at a city council meeting and speak in the public forum, and that's a great way to interact with people. But it's also, we get emails so much every day, and I hand out my cell phone like it's candy. So most people are texting me, and sometimes I have 152 texts that I have to catch up on, but we're there and we're listening, and you can definitely reach me at any time, and you can just look online or talk to me after, and I won't give out my credentials right now, but I do believe that's how you respond to people, having robust conversations. And I like what Jacob pointed out, where if you get educated a little bit before you bring your information forward, it's helpful, not because it helps you understand that the person is listening to you, because there's such a robust conversation happening with your elected officials, and they're hearing from so many multiple sides all of the time. So if you're educated on the material, they'll be able to have a conversation with you that says, hey, and these are the other 50 sides that I had to look at. Now let's talk about those and be open-minded. So great way to discuss with them.
About the growth of Utah Valley. What are some ways that we can plan, coordinate, and manage growth in Utah Valley?
I feel like I'm the only one talking. I know you guys have answers. So there is a lot of growth coming in, and I'll just talk about it from my own city's perspective, but a lot of growth is coming in, and it's building in the right place and at the right time and together. And so we always say we're doing smart city design, and smart city design allows you to build city centers with integrated living, offering a variety of different housing types that allows you to preserve open space and preserve agriculture. And I think as we can connect those silos of conversation of saying we have an affordable housing crisis, and there's a lot of people coming in on that side, we have land that we need to preserve, we have agriculture that's important to us. As we connect those silos, we can grow better together.
So to put some numbers on it, Davis County has about 45,000 developable acres right now. Salt Lake County has 55,000 developable acres, and Utah County has 255,000 developable acres. So if you're wondering where the growth is coming, it's here. And that with that comes we need to be planning out ahead on our infrastructure. the legislators for this area, we meet together and we work really hard on trying to prioritize which infrastructure projects need to go forward and need to get funded, and that, we kind of have to try to pull our weight to get that money into the infrastructure that we need. And so, there's a lot that goes into planning for growth, because you're needing to have family sustaining jobs. You need to have an infrastructure that supports not just the growth, but the movement throughout the valley for that growth. And you need to have the type of infrastructure where you have an environmental, you have a quality of life that people still enjoy. Part of what we're trying to do with Utah Lake is to create an environment that people will enjoy, and we need to protect the lake. With that growth comes risk to the lake. And if we're not forward thinking on how we're managing that risk to the lake and how we're managing how people interact, we want people to interact with the lake. It's a wonderful asset that we've been treating like a liability for a long, long time. And so part of what we're trying to do is project out into the future. How are people going to be interacting with the lake? Are they doing so safely? And is it going to be a positive experience? And those are all things that we're trying to manage and plan for far into the future. The lake may be, it may be 100 years out before we get it to what anyone here is imagining in their minds. But we need to take those steps now to start moving the ball down the line, to to take this wonderful resource and protect it and improve it.
Excellent. So along those lines of growth, we have a question about effluent and wastewater treatment. So they ask, what new wastewater treatment facilities are proposed or planned for around the north and west sides of the lake?
I can try to answer that. We have about 7 wastewater treatment plants that discharge either to Utah Lake or to tributaries that are very close to Utah Lake. They are, many of them upgrading right now. We have upgrades, very expensive upgrades going on in Provo City, Spanish Fork City, Payson City, Salem City just constructed a brand new facility. Timpanogos Special Service District is the largest in the valley. They serve 11 communities, I believe, in northern Utah County. Any growth that comes into the northern part of the county will connect to Timpanogos. In terms of the west side, we've got Eagle Mountain, which is a non-discharging facility, and we are working with Utah County to start talking about what the plan is for sewer on the southern and kind of southwest side of the lake as growth continues. We're tracking that quite closely, and as those upgrades occur, they're not only reducing nutrient loads, but they're also planning for growth.
Great, thank you, Erica. Another question that we have is, and this is a science geared question, is how much do Utah Lake levels fluctuate and how does this influence the harmful algal blooms on Utah Lake?
On average from year to year, there's about a 2 to 3 foot variation in lake fluctuation. Some years we get up to 5 feet in fluctuation. According to the studies and current day realities, there seems to be algae blooms that can happen on low lake level or low runoff years because we've got evaporation taking place in the lake. High runoff years, we get a flushing event that clears nutrients from our riverbeds. And so there's algae are very, very well adapted over the billions of years that they've been on the planet. And so we have bloom responses to most of the variables, and the lake temperatures really don't change much from low lake to high lake. It's so shallow that it, generally speaking, represents ambient temperature of the summer. So
I just saw, and this is new data based on the satellite record, but there is a relatively strong correlation between lake level and likelihood of a bloom. So in Sinead Tate's master's thesis, which is available now on BYU's website, they found that about 30% of the variability, the likelihood of having a bloom, was associated with the level of the lake. So just like Eric said, you can have a high water year that still has a bloom, but it's more likely that you get a bloom during low water Hello, what are you?
I would also add, when you say 2 feet of water level, on the west side of the lake, that can be 250 yards of property. So on the west side, it fluctuates in size, just 2 feet. I mean, 6 inches can be 100 yards.
Thank you for that. One of the questions that came in is, what is the difference between the Utah Lake Commission and the Utah Lake Authority?
It's the last word.
So Utah Lake Commission is an interlocal agency. And what that means is that it is a coalition of various cities, and they work together with their own jurisdiction to try to influence the lake. They don't actually have a lot of authority to do anything inside the lake, except for authority granted by other agencies. The Utah Lake Authority would be a body that is, it also has no taxing authority at the Lake Commission, and it also has no ability to bond, or it's kind of more of a coalition of volunteers, of volunteer government agencies to try to improve the lake. The Utah Lake Authority is a little bit different. It has a core mission that would be, number 1, improve the water quality. Number 2, improve the environmental aspects of the lake. Number 3, it would be to improve the recreational experience on the lake. And number 4, improve the economic opportunities on the lake. So, and it has the authority to do that within the boundaries of the lake. It also has some taxing authority so that you can have resources to it. Those are the primary differences. So if you needed to get equipment to care for the lake, and that equipment required a bond of some sort, the Utah Lake Authority would have a funding source to go out and get that bond and have the equipment to be able to do something with the lake. What we see is, up until now, I think we've got a long history of a lot of people who care about the lake and no one who has the authority or the ability to actually make a difference on the lake, or as much of a difference as we would like them to. I think the Lake Commission has done a wonderful job with the tools that they've been given, but we need a bigger shovel. That's, to care for this lake, we need a bigger shovel than what we have. And the Lake Authority is intended to be a bigger shovel.
Thank you. Another question that might end up going to Representative Brammer. Who makes the final decision to allow the Utah Lake Restoration Project to proceed? And how can the public be involved in that decision?
Sure. So that decision is made by, it's made by the EPA and it's made by the Department of Natural Resources. And so the Utah Lake Authority was never meant to be like a lake restoration project thing. It's actually meant to be flexible enough that whether that happened or didn't, there's someone who can make decisions and has authority and ability to do something better for the lake. It's agnostic towards that idea. Or
Forestry, fire, and state
lands. Forestry, fire, and state lands. That's who will ultimately make the call on that. And that's, yeah.
Yeah, forestry, as I stated earlier, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is currently reviewing that application and proposal. So at this time, we are the ones who would make the final decision on that.
Scheduling public input on that decision.
We don't have a date at this time.
And I just wanted to say, I believe this is true for Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and I know it would be true for any exchanges under the Utah Lake Authority.
Can't hear you.
But there is also a requirement for approval for any leases or exchanges by the Legislative Management Committee. So theoretically, there is at some point the Utah legislature stepping in so that it's not simply bureaucratic bodies. But I will say, and again, this is sort of my shtick, that there is also significant consideration or maybe deliberation that would have to happen not only through administrative or legislative processes, but also theoretically by courts who will be interested in determining the exact boundaries of Article 20 of the Utah Constitution and of the state's public trust obligations. Right now, FFSL operates under Title 65A of the Utah Code, which says they can, give exchanges or leases as limited by the public trust. And the Utah Lake Authority bill would require that the Utah Lake Authority only act as authorized by the Utah Constitution. So what that means is very much, I'm confident, up for grabs.
Okay, our next question is, what lessons can we learn from the Great Salt Lake or from Bear Lake or from Lake Tahoe, other lakes in the Mountain West? What have we learned about management, science, or legal issues from these other lakes?
I think they're very different lakes than Utah Lake, is the first thing. Utah Lake is one of the, it is unique in its lake bed ownership for the state. That's a different thing. We went to the Supreme Court and fought for that. And that creates a very different dynamic. Additionally, Utah Lake's role within the larger water system is also very unique compared to a lot of the other lakes on it. And those are only a couple of the issues. I'm sure that if we sat here, we could go through a lot of really, it is a unique lake with both from a legal perspective as to its ownership and how it's treated, as well as from an ecological perspective.
I really agree with that. And I don't mean to steal Erica's line, but I've heard her say, what we've learned about Utah Lake is it's different. And it's interesting, a study came out just a couple of weeks ago that compared Utah Lake to other large water bodies in the West. They found that Utah Lake had less intense algal blooms than the majority of lakes. It ended up in the lower quartile. So again, it's different, and we bring expectations to ecosystems. And so I've heard various people say, oh, we could
We're just following with Jake, Chris. Yeah, sorry, we forgot before that. All right, we'd like to welcome you to the final session of the live event. In this session, we're going to have a series of short talks on updates from various projects associated with Utah Lake. We're really happy to start with Jake Holdaway, a longtime resident of the lake and the leader of the Wakara Way project. So Jake, I'll give you just a hand signal when you're ready, and then you, or when we're 1 minute from the end. And then if you want to ask live questions of the presenters, if they leave time for that, then feel free. But if you want to take the whole time, that's fine as well. All right, thank you, Jake.
Hey guys, my name is Jake Holdaway. I am a citizen. For my profession, for the last 17 years, I've heard governments argue and fight with the National Association of Counties and the National League of Cities. It's an organization that brings together the best minds to fix different county and city problems. So I felt when I got to get into this, I was blessed to have that background. I'm also the great grandson of a man named Shadrach Holdaway. Not going to get emotional, and I don't share this family information lightly, but I do share it because it helps you understand why I know so much about the lake. Shadrach Holdaway was born in Nauvoo, Illinois, and 3 months before Joseph Smith died, and he was a member of the Mormon Battalion. He went to San Diego, got some gold, and he's the first Mormon documented to pay his tithing in gold. The church needed a loan to get people across the plains, and Shadrach stepped up. And through that loan, Shadrach was entrusted with a lot of land that was on Utah Lake. He was a pioneer. I live in his homestead home, and I have the ability to carry his shoulders. And I think about it a lot. His son, Amos Holdaway, this is about 50 years before the United States came in, Shadrach, was selected. And you got to understand, this is the territory of Mexico. We're not here in the United States yet for 50 years. Amos was selected as one of the first county commissioners of Utah County. He was not voted in, he was appointed by the prophet Brigham Young. His job was to be the visionary to set out the course for the waterways of this valley. So he had to think and plan hundreds of years in advance and say, what is this valley going to look like? Well, who's going to come? Obviously, in Mormon doctrine, they believed a lot of people would come, and it has come to fruition. That pipe was built first by wood, not by the green pipe you're seeing in this picture. And that pipe serviced many different farmers. They brought out water shares and they divided it into different canals. And his son, Walter, one of the first stake presidents of Orem, took over the property that is now the Holdaway family property, where now stands Sleepy Ridge Golf Course. His son, Robert, my grandfather, just recently passed away with his wife, Kamora. And so a couple years before they were gonna die, I engaged them about what we were gonna do with our wetland property and started to dream out what should happen. Now, when I was a kid, I remember Utah Lake as open and short green grass. And I would sit on the tractor with my grandfather, Robert, and he would tell me everything about the history of who I was. I would know about Shadrach and meeting with the tribes when they came in here with Brigham Young. And I would find out they lived on the shore of Utah Lake. And I learned about grinding stones, and I learned about wiki-ups, and I learned about arrowheads. And I would always go down to Utah Lake and I would find them. And I was always shocked that nobody knew this history. I was always shocked that, hey, wiki-ups were always built here. And it was open access when I was a kid. There weren't any problems. I read a newspaper article one time, and I decided to get engaged and kind of find out about it. This is the same picture in the same spot. Now, one of the things you need to understand about the history, and I'm not talking about the lake, I'm going to be talking about the lake shore, the shoreline. For hundreds and hundreds of years, Utah Lake was the source of food for all of the buffalo, deer, and the elk. That's where all the herds were. That's why the Indian tribes came to hunt here, right? And when my ancestors came in and brought water, we took all of this sagebrush desert and we turned it into this green valley where the herds didn't have to come back to. They didn't have to go down to the water line to be able to eat in the wetlands. They came up and they were able to eat so many things. And the herds went away. Now those were taken over by dairy farmers in Vineyard, Orem, Provo, and along the lakeshore. And so at that time, they put up barbed wire and the lakeshore still maintained clean. The grasses would be eaten and it would stay short. There was a litigation problem with the state of Utah. Going back, and you have to understand why, the Holdaways were here 50 years before the United States government was here. So who owns the land, right? And then when it came, Amos was the first county commissioner. So there weren't really property lines, and the lake fluctuate in height, right? And so I knew these things, I knew why, and I knew the litigation that went over for 30 or 40 years. So when I started to navigate, is this an ownership process or is this a stewardship? My family's had the stewardship of this property for a long time. And sometimes when you're an owner, you're not a great steward. Does that make sense? There's a separation there. So I started to recognize what public access or things we needed to protect. I wanted to protect the eagles. I wanted to protect the fishing and the hunting. I wanted to fit, I also noticed that when that litigation happened, all of the hoofed animals were removed. So we're not going to have any buffalo, we're not going to have any deer, we're not going to have any elk come back at the levels that we need to maintain a healthy ecosystem. They're just not going to come back. The dairy farmers went bankrupt around between 1998 and 2003. They all went bankrupt. So there's no hoofed animals to send down there to have a natural grooming. So when it started to happen, I just started to notice this massive forest grow up around the lake. And I kept saying to myself, like, when are we going to bring a herd to naturally clean through this? And so there's also a fire problem that would go through the lake as well. I also wanted to make sure we recognize the ancestral land that we're only stewards and we've only been here for a very short amount of time. I also knew of the state's desire to put in a 50-year bike trail through this private property. And there's a lot of different private property owners, not just my family, but others. And so how do we help and go through that? And so we went through and we learned about grazing. These are pictures from Ogden Bay, what happens when there's a grazing process. And I also, when I dreamed up, my great-grandfather, Walter, he was the visionary to be able to say, hey, in 1940s and 50s, he said, look, we need to save land for Sierra Shell. We need to have a public setup to be able to do that. And I know that my grandfather, Walter, didn't think about Colin Ray concerts that are going on right now, right? But he did think about setting forth land for future generations. And he did think about the public trust. And so with that process, that's where I started the Walk Our Way process. It's just saying, how can we gobble up all of this wetlands to be able to protect it? And I went to every government entity. Like I said, there's 25 government entities that touch the property. Being Utah Lake Commission at the head, Eric Ellis has been fantastic in understanding and learning it. He's setting up meetings. He's actually the head. I'm not. This land for public access. So the plan is to, number one, identify the 1,000 acres. And I want to point out, because we're in a really good spot, stop looking at the power slide and just look out the window and say, from right over there to the bay, where the Ogden Bay, passing over our farm, which is that green field right over there, and then going 3 power lines over, there's 1,000 acres, and it goes between 1,000 and 650 acres. And so that's the property, and being able to go through and have stopped the dropping of chemicals, stop the drop. We've been dropping millions of dollars of pesticides and herbicides to just kill everything. And I know that for thousands of years, herds moved and they kind of cleaned it out. And so this is an effort to have it go through the stomach of a hoofed animal to reduce the nitrogen content of it. This is what it's today. On the left-hand side is no Walk Our Way. It's 15-foot tall Phragmites. On the right-hand side, it's gone. The problem is gone. The mosquitoes are not there at all as well, and it's been a clean process. So every lake in the state of Utah has a grazing program connected to it. The only lake that doesn't is Utah Lake. So reintroducing that, fixing my great-grandfather's field drains of how they flow to be able to use them to bring back ducks and geese, holding governments accountable and saying, we want eagles' nests. Where do we want them? How can we rehabilitate them and put them in? Introducing public access points so that we can have people come in and engage the property and connecting where that is. And the last thing is I want to thank my grandma. And my grandma passed away last August, a year ago. She's the only one that believed in my dream. And one of the things that I like about this symposium is that my great-grandfather Amos did not put the pipe all by himself. He had thousands of people working to do that. And when we think about Utah Lake, Jake Holdaway, Eric Ellis, Brammer, there's a lot of people, but it takes more than just 3. And I would just say that, like, each one of you guys that are in the room, you have an expertise. Might be trails like Bike Walk Provo, or it might be site bird watching, that I don't have that expertise, and maybe the government entity doesn't. Don't think that you're insignificant. Dream, and then be a part of the solution. And our plan has gotten better year over year by engaging in others and saying, hey, we need to think about 100 years down the road. So with that, thanks guys, and we're excited about it. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're not already a friend of the Walk Our Way Facebook group, you can become a friend of it. And next week I'll post a tour where you can come and walk through the 50-acre pilot. And we'll be able to demonstrate and show you, look at all the ducks, look at all the geese, look at where they don't engage, because they don't engage where the Phragmites is. Look at how much have come back. We've had 2 eagles already nest this year, something we haven't seen in 30 years. So come in and take a tour, and we're happy to show you what that's all about. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jake. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Chris Kelleher, who will be giving an update on the June sucker recovery.
Also see if I can track down my water bottle. Yep.
I'll give you 2 in a 1 minute.
Thanks, Ben. So as Ben mentioned, I'll be giving an update on the June sucker recovery implementation program. I work for the Utah Division of Wildlife, but serve as the director of the June sucker program. Let's start off with a brief timeline here. Back in 1889, the first fish survey was conducted on Utah Lake by David Starr Jordan, and he declared Utah Lake the greatest sucker pond in the universe. In 1980, less than 100 years later, June sucker were listed as an endangered species due to lack of recruitment. By the early 90s, June suckers were precariously near extinction, and they remained only as rapidly shrinking and aging remnant population without recent successful reproduction. By the late 90s, when I started working on June sucker, we had a population of about 300 individuals, and that's all there was. What was going on in the lake? We had these aged adults that were still coming in and successfully spawning and producing young June sucker. But these young fish didn't live past 20 years of age, or 20 days of age. And that's about the time when they finish up feeding off their yolk sac and have to start actively feeding. In 2002, a group of stakeholders got together and they formed the June sucker recovery implementation program. Program had 2 goals. One, to recover June sucker so that it no longer needed the protection of the Endangered Species Act. And the other was to allow for continued operation of existing water facilities and future development of water resources for human use. The important point here is that the program, as long as it is making sufficient progress towards recovery, serves as the Endangered Species Act compliance for water development in the drainage. So the species was threatened with imminent extinction, and we did some triage. We collected some of these old individuals. These fish were 40 years old, coming into spawn. We collected them on the banks of the Provo River, artificially spawned them, and raised some fish in our hatchery system. We raised them up to about 8 inches. We put them back out in the lake. They survived, they grew, and they returned to the adult spawning population. So we averted the extinction early on in the program. But we still had this bottleneck in this early life stage of the fish. And the program operates on the best available science and makes their decisions based on that. But we didn't have a lot of science pertaining to Utah Lake or to the June sucker. So we're really heavy into the research in the early stages of the program. One of the first things we did to benefit this early life stage was develop some flow targets and start acquiring water for the lower Provo River. We developed these flow targets. They're ecosystem based, and they're based on the natural hydrology of the Provo River. And they're also adaptable for different conditions for a given water year. We also started looking at developing habitat for these young fish. The tributaries coming into Utah Lake had all been channelized to allow for water delivery and reduce flood impacts. And we went in to restore some of the habitat complexity that these early life stages needed. Here's a picture of Hobble Creek, which was restored in 2008. And we actually reconnected the creek with the lake. Within the first spring after that restoration, we had June sucker come in to spawn. And that winter, we had the first documented overwinter survival of naturally produced June sucker in the system. I won't talk about this because Melissa's going to share some information there. When we started looking at the lake and seeing what was wrong out there, we knew there was a dominance of carp out in the lake. The biomass, the fish biomass in Utah Lake was comprised of 90% common carp, which are a non-native species that were introduced to help supplement food supplies back in the 1880s. But as early as 1900, Fish Commissioner Tullian visited Utah Lake, and he said the carp had thriven immensely. They'd eaten off all the mosses and similar growth along the bottom. What you end up with when you have carp in a system is they really simplify the system by eliminating all the aquatic macrophytes. So you end up with a system where primary productivity is driven by algae. Your invertebrate community is predominantly made up of benthic invertebrates like the midges here on the left, and then certainly the dominant carp population. We entered into a large-scale carp removal effort, the biggest ever in the world, and we successfully achieved our target in 2018 of a 75% reduction in the carp biomass in the lake. And this is equivalent to 123 blue whales in biomass, and that's the biggest animal in the world there. So what's our response? Well, at June sucker today, there's tens of thousands of these fish in Utah Lake. And just this year, the fish was downlisted from endangered to threatened. Huge milestone for the program. So now we're focusing on delisting, but we have to understand and recognize that June sucker is what's termed a conservation reliant species. And that even after delisting, we're going to still have to implement management actions to keep that population healthy out there. So just some important points to wrap up. The June sucker program serves as the ESA compliance for water development in the drainage. And the program has made significant investments in Utah Lake and the recovery of June sucker, which resulted in the recent downlisting. We're on track for recovery and delisting, recognizing that ongoing management will be required once the species is delisted. And that's all I have. Here's my contact information. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know about you, but I find myself almost with the shivers seeing the good things going on for both of these last presentations. I'm now really excited to welcome Melissa Stamp to the stage to give an overview of the Provo River Delta Recovery Program. I'll give you a 2 minute and a 1 minute. Okay. My job, sorry.
Thank you. You probably can hear me now. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. And also the camera on me. So yeah, I'm short. Again, my name is Melissa Stamp, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I appreciate having the symposium. Thank you to the organizers. So I am the lead project coordinator for the Provo River Delta Restoration Project. And I work for a small federal agency called the Mitigation Commission. And our agency is responsible for environmental mitigation for the Central Utah Project, which is the federally funded series of dams and pipelines that help the state of Utah tap its share of Colorado River water. And so I'll start off with an overview slide that hopefully you guys can see. And to get yourselves oriented on this map, Utah Lake State Park is at the bottom left. And for everyone who's attending live, it's right out there. So you can actually see Utah Lake State Park, and we're north of that is what we're seeing on this map. And the Delta Restoration Project involves diverting the majority of the Provo River's flow north into a series of constructed river channels and delta ponds on about 260 acres of agricultural land that we've acquired for the project purpose. One other element I want to emphasize is that we'll have to lower the northern half of Skipper Bay Dike to allow Utah Lake to expand eastward and reoccupy something closer to its historic shoreline. I want to emphasize also that the existing river channel will remain in place and continue to receive a small amount of water flow. Another element of the project with the existing channel is building a small dam downstream in the state park area that will maintain a more constant water elevation in that existing river section downstream of where the delta will be diverted into. We'll also be involved with many recreation features. That's another purpose of the project. So trail systems that tie into the Wakara Way trail system that you just heard about to the north, and also that tie into the existing Provo River Parkway trail system, creating some new loop opportunities for recreation in the area. Along the existing channel, we're partnering with Utah County to install some fishing platforms, boating access points, and interpretive signage, and also with Provo City Parks and Recreation to create a new community park called Delta Gateway Park at the diversion point. So that's kind of an overview of the features that are involved with the project. So what's it going to look like in this new Delta area? This is a slide showing the Hobble Creek Restoration Project that Chris had a slide of as well. And again, that project was completed in 2008. And really the idea here is to connect the river channels to a very expansive set of well-vegetated wetland habitats that create great habitat for nursery for small young fish and rearing habitat. And that gets back to the bottleneck that Chris alluded to, with the fish still having trouble completing their full life cycle. And this connected river and wetland, well-vegetated wetland habitat is what is currently lacking in the existing Provo River channel. And that is what this project is intended to solve. So at its heart, the underlying need for this project is tied to June sucker recovery. And I'll just mention while I have this slide up that this is definitely very much a multi-agency effort. It's being implemented under that umbrella of the June sucker recovery program, which includes 10 agencies. We're also partnering with additional stakeholders and agencies outside of that umbrella of 10 entities. So just it's very much a collaborative team effort. And again, this is a silly cartoon, but it kind of gets the idea that we want to go from this cold, deep water to with lack of vegetation to a much more productive system where the fish can hide from predators and find good food sources. And this is another emphasis, what Chris kind of mentioned. We've got the Provo River Delta, which is essential for June sucker recovery. And then the recovery of the June sucker is tied to water supply because of the environmental commitments associated with the federal water projects. And I've been drinking some water that I filled up here, and I have some Central Utah Project water molecules in my body right now. And probably most of you do too, because it's a very critical water source for the entire Wasatch Front, Utah and Salt Lake Valleys. Okay, I want you to see the orange line on this map that I'm sharing, and that is where a berm and trail system will be built for the project. Again, that will connect to these other lakeshore systems. And we have to lower the north half of Skipper Bay Dike and remove that trail, but it will pivot down to this new orange line. And that will essentially become the new shoreline of the lake. And when I say new, there's that Stephen King quote, I think, everything old is new again, because our project is happening in the very upper left on this slide. And in 1856, it was mapped as being in the bed of Utah Lake. For that matter, so was the lower mile of the existing Provo River, which has been turned into land with diking and levees and pumping. Makes sense at the time, but that's why the larval fish are getting stuck, because there's no gradient, because it's literally part of the lake in its natural state. And so we're restoring not just the river, but also a historic bay and shoreline, Skipper Bay of Utah Lake. And let's see if I can get it. Construction-wise, we started last year. We're planning to be complete in 2024, and I'm running out of time. So I just want to land on, it's a very significant project. It's an ambitious project. It's a well-funded project. And I think what means the most to me kind of personally is I feel like it's a project that honors the natural history of this special place. We're restoring delta processes and ecology to the largest tributary of the third largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. This amazing remnant, shallow inland lake of Lake Bonneville. And we're recovering a fish that has this great history of feeding human settlement for many thousands of years to the valley. And it's also a testament to collaboration and persistence. And I hope it's a catalyst for additional projects into the future.
Thank you, Melissa. Again, really cool to see the cultural and scientific and economic investment in the lake. I'm really pleased to welcome Gabriella Lawson, Sam Bratzman, and Zach Anderud to the stage. I don't quite know if they're gonna, okay, just the two of you, Gabriella and Sam, to talk about a recently completed project on harmful algal blooms on the lake. Oh yeah, you can use one of those. And would you like the PowerPoint version or the PDF?
Whichever's easiest for you.
Okay.
Do
we like algal blooms?
No.
Looks like I only have the PDF here.
Yeah, the PDF is all I sent.
Okay, cool.
That's why I thought it was a strange question.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I was like, oh, I don't know.
So I'll just start out while they finish getting this ready. My name is Sam Bratzman. This is Gabby Lawson. We're both master students at BYU right now, finishing up our research. We've been working on a similar project in Utah Lake, looking at nutrients and how they're related to algal blooms. It is pretty science heavy. We're talking a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus, so just bear with us. You can talk to us afterwards. We're right over here. But before we get started, of course, we want to acknowledge all the people that have helped us with our research. We have a ton of great collaborators. And those who have funded us, right? BYU and the Utah Department of Environmental Quality have been instrumental. And of course, we want to recognize the Tipinogus Nation as the original inhabitants of the land.
Great, thank you, Sam. So blooms on Utah Lake are made up of phytoplankton, and phytoplankton consists of cyanobacteria, which are prokaryotic organisms that produce really harmful toxins that are damaging to people and animals, as well as green algae, diatoms, and dinoflagellates, which are all eukaryotic organisms that do not produce any toxins, but are still damaging to the overall ecosystem when in abundance. All of these organisms are photosynthetic, and that means that they rely on light for their power. In addition to light, they also need nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. When we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, though, not all forms are created equal. Some are more bioavailable than others. So we're going to be talking in terms of dissolved inorganic nitrogen, or DIN, and soluble reactive phosphorus, or SRP. And our big questions that we set out to answer were, what nutrients are influencing blooms and when, and what nutrient concentrations will reduce phytoplankton? So our lab has been studying Utah Lake for a few years now. We've done multiple studies monitoring lake seasonal water quality characteristics and bloom dynamics across several different lake locations. And most recently, we conducted bioassays where we collected water from 3 different sites across Utah Lake: Provo Bay, which is highly impacted by urbanization; the east, which is moderately impacted by urbanization, and the west, which is lightly impacted by urbanization, but will continue to be more impacted by urbanization as we progress into the future. Water from each of these sites was taken and were subjected to nutrient additions or dilutions, and then incubated in a common garden. Now we'll talk a little bit about light. So Utah Lake is quite shallow and turbid, but despite this turbidity, light still penetrates into the water column at depths of 20 to 50 centimeters based on Secchi depth reads. The deepest depths occur in the summer and late summer when phytoplankton are most active. So while light does limit phytoplankton, and we accounted for this limitation by adding a shade cover and the plastic cubitaners reducing light by 45%, light limitation is not stopping phytoplankton from responding to nutrient additions. So here are some of our results. Right now, what we're looking at is chlorophyll A concentrations and phycocyanin concentrations. Chlorophyll A is an indicator of phytoplankton biomass, and phycocyanin is our indicator of cyanobacterial abundance. So you can see that there are clear seasonal trends, and we see that Provo Bay especially supports a lot of phytoplankton, followed by the east, especially in those summer through fall months, peaks in late summer. And the east and Provo Bay support the most cyanobacteria. The east especially, we see a large peak in those summer months. Now, when we added our nutrient additions, we found that the nitrogen and phosphorus increased phytoplankton abundance in the summer, late summer, and fall across all lake locations. And we found that phosphorus alone increased cyanobacteria abundance throughout these summer months. And we found that nitrogen in the east and Provo Bay, so those areas that are impacted by urbanization. And we also found that nitrogen alone increased cyanobacteria abundance in the west, the area that's less impacted by urbanization. Now, how does this relate to toxin concentrations? Well, it's pretty complicated. So you can see here in the east for microcystin, there's a peak in the summer month that corresponds to a peak in phycocyanin concentrations in the east. However, the rest of the toxin concentrations do not correlate very well to the biomass that we were observing. So it's not a great indicator to say, oh, there's a lot of phycocyanin, there's a lot of cyanobacteria. That means we're going to see a lot of cyanotoxins, because we're actually seeing in the spring, for example, very big peaks for cylindrospermopsin, anatoxin, even microcystin is quite high when our phycocyanin levels are really low and we're not really seeing bloom conditions. Great, Sam, take it away.
So one of the questions that we wanted to answer, right, is at what level of nutrients are we going to see these algal blooms? And we set out to answer this question with a specific experiment in the middle of last summer, where we diluted lake water samples and added nitrogen or phosphorus or both, just to see how the algae would react and other organisms would react to that, how much growth there would be. And this is the results of that experiment. I'm going to be looking a lot at this chlorophyll A graph and the nutrients over here. So we can see from the chlorophyll graph, there's a pretty clear division between two groups there, where there was more growth with the red, yellow, and blue, and below them, there was less growth. That's what we want, right? And then looking at the nutrient concentrations from each of those groups and the DIM, or the nitrogen that's available, there's a pretty even split where there's high concentrations on each side and there's low concentrations on each side. So there's not a big correlation for nitrogen. But if we're looking at SRP, or the phosphorus that's available to these organisms, there's a pretty clear correlation. These groups that had less growth in them, they had really small amounts of phosphorus. There's about 0.005 milligrams per liter, which is pretty small. But above the line where there actually was growth, there was always higher amounts of phosphorus. So we know that the phosphorus is a big control on how much growth we have and how intense the blooms are. So knowing this, we looked at some of our seasonal data. And these lower concentrations that we set as kind of thresholds for how much growth is going to happen. The thresholds we set for SRP, right, being 0.005, as I mentioned before. And looking at our seasonal data, we are at or above that concentration for almost all of the year, especially summer to late summer. where we see we're way above our concentrations. And there's a lot of algal growth in that time period. For DIN, right, we're about at or around that threshold that we set. So we're not as worried about these high concentrations of nitrogen, except for Linden Marina in late summer. I don't know what happens, if anyone knows. But in knowing this, we propose that there needs to be a dual management strategy where we focus on maintaining levels of nitrogen, specifically DIN, right, and lowering levels of SRP, or phosphorus, that's in the lake. In doing this, we can reduce the amount of algal blooms that occur in the lake and the intensity of the algal blooms. We think this management strategy should be in terms of DIN and SRP, the nitrogen and phosphorus forms, since those are the most bioavailable. We converted our thresholds here to total nitrogen and total phosphorus. That is the rough estimate, but we believe there needs to be more research into kind of the ratios between total phosphorus and SRP. We know that can be kind of strange sometimes. And also further experiments to figure out exactly where the threshold is. We have a rough idea, but we want a better idea, right? And also with toxins, we would like to know if you want to learn more. I know that was a lot to take in 7 minutes, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Gabby. Now there's a slight change in the program that happened after we printed. So now we're going to hear from John Mabey from the Utah Water Task Force. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Thank you. And I'll give you a 2-minute and a 1-minute notification. Okay, there you are.
So how do I advance?
You just can click or or the arrows.
Thank you, Dan. I actually serve on the Utah Water Task Force, which is a legislative executive branch body that considers all matters related to water in terms of policy and legislation. But today I'm here as an attorney that represent a lot of water users that are impacted by Utah Lake. One of my clients is the Utah Lake Water Users Association. They own and operate the Utah Lake pumping station on the northwest corner of the lake that controls the lake level and the pumping of water out of the lake to serve water users. So I'm here in a little bit different perspective. I'm not here to talk about microbiology or anything like that. I'm here to talk about the human life form and how do we use the lake to sustain agriculture and our drinking water supplies. And on a more personal note, I grew up on a family farm in South Jordan, Utah that relies on Utah Lake water, and the farm continues to operate. There aren't many farms left in South Jordan if you've been out there lately, but our family still continues in that venture. Although it's not me, it's my cousin. Let's see here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump what normally is a conclusion slide. My first slide is going to be what 5 things I want to make sure you understand. And then if we have time to go into more detail, we will. So there are important facts that people need to understand on how the lake functions as a water storage reservoir. In the late 1800s, water started to be stored by water users in Salt Lake County because they were having a difficult time sustaining a irrigation season long water supply. So they installed a dam. And as a result, there are these primary water rights, these primary water supplies in the lake. that are used, for irrigation. Then also that came on later is a very important concept to understand as to how the lake provides drinking water in both Utah and Salt Lake counties. We don't drink the lake, right? But indirectly, the water storage in Utah Lake allows reservoirs like Jordanelle Reservoir, part of the Central Utah Project, to be built. And they do that by bringing down from Strawberry Reservoir through Spanish Fork Canyon, waters from the Duchesne River system, and they store it in Utah Lake. And that replaces the water that would have come down from the Provo River system, but instead is stored up in Jordanelle. And Jordanelle is a main water supplier for culinary drinking water purposes. And so having Utah Lake as a storage reservoir is an extremely important function that must continue to exist. Secondly, as part of being a reservoir, it's operated for flood control purposes. Jacob Holdaway's family has experienced the ebbs and flows and the rising of the lake. And so when the lake was first dammed, the question came for the Utah landowners surrounding the lake, well, how high up is this going to go? How do we protect Utah Lake landowners? And then on the other side of the coin is, how do you protect landowners down on the Jordan River? And so the lake, there are agreements, et cetera, that control that kind of thing. 2 minutes. So then the third thing you need to understand, and I've already mentioned it, is that the lake is used for irrigation. Not only in Utah, Salt Lake County, but in Utah County, there are some canals that use it. It's used for industrial purposes. Kennecott Copper relies heavily on the water supply out of the lake. And then for the municipal water supplies that I talked about. Now, the Utah Lake operations and the water supply depend on decrees, agreements, and regulations that have developed over 100 years. So there's this delicate balance based on decrees, agreements, state engineer regulations on how the lake's operated, that if those are disrupted, then our current management system falls by the wayside. And so today's lake features of the surface area of the lake, the depth of the lake, and how today's lake levels fluctuate. All of those features and characteristics of today is how the management system is now dependent on. If you change the lake elevations by whatever kind of action, if you're going to dig holes or whatever in the lake, or you're going to do whatever kind of projects you want, you can think about, if it's going to affect the lake elevations, you're going to have problems. So just let me go to this last slide. This is a picture of the outlet of the Jordan River. This on the bottom left corner is the outlet gate, which is closed while water is being stored. And then up in the middle center of the photo is the Utah Lake Pump Station. And that's also closed during storage. But once the lake level reaches a level of 4,489 feet, then the compromise decree, agreement and decree that was issued in 1985 requires that you have to open up the outlet gate and let the water go down the Jordan River. It cannot reach a certain height. But at the same time, if there are actions taken that are going to lower the elevation of the lake and historically how it's operated, that's going to leave that pump station high and dry. And so those are some of the concerns and some of the issues that the Utah Lake Water Users Association is dealing with in making sure we can maintain the water supply functions of the lake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Happy to welcome Andrew Follett from Yale University, now to discuss legal opportunities and constraints involving the lake. And I'll give you 2 minutes and 1 minute.
Sure, thank you. I'll try to be quick.
How do I hide these? Hide floating. There we are.
Sure. Good afternoon. I know I've had a few